my father, Shlomo Zalman ben Simcha Tzvi. It's customary to have a shiur or limud Torah, Leilui Nishmat, and so that's what we're going to do. Now, in terms of Avelut, we know that a lot of the rules of Avelut are based on customs, and what sometimes happens is that we're not really familiar with our own family customs of Avelut, because it could very well be in a situation that you never necessarily, maybe you don't even see your parents sitting Shiva, so you don't know the minhagim, and then, it's not things that you're going to talk about too much, and then when someone passes away, then you don't really necessarily even know your own family minhagim. So I'll just start in this fashion, that when it was the time for the Shiva, and we were covering the mirror in the house, so what happened was that the person who would help out in the house, who was Melvin, who was a Filipino guy, he said, "Oh yeah, we do this also in the Philippines." And at that point, I thought, this is then bears investigation. How is it that we have this custom to cover the mirrors, and this guy from the Philippines does this as well? So therefore, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the thing is, in terms of mirrors, the idea of covering a mirror in the Shiva House as a sign of mourning is something that clearly is not found in the Torah, even though mirrors are mentioned in the Torah. We know that the marot is the women donated their mirrors in order to make the Mizbeach Nechoshet, but presumably they weren't glass mirrors, they were just very polished copper. But we have mirrors are mentioned in halachic literature in other contexts, but covering mirrors in terms of Avelut is not mentioned in the Gemara, it's not mentioned in the Midrash, it's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch does talk about mirrors once in a while. We have also, even before the Shulchan Aruch, the Radvaz talked about the idea of not davening in front of a mirror. However, the idea of covering a mirror in a Shiva house, that's already in the 1500s they talked about that, but covering a mirror in the Shiva house does not appear in any halachic source whatsoever until we get to the Chatam Sofer. Now, the Chatam Sofer, he lived in the late 1700s, and his mention of the idea to cover mirrors in the Shiva house, and we'll see it's not exactly even covering mirrors in a Shiva house, we can more or less date very accurately where this was found, because it is found in the Chatam Sofer's Drashot. And in his book of Drashot, the Drashot are arranged in chronological order. And there's one set of the Drashot there that are Hespedim, various eulogies. And there's a eulogy that was given in March 1832, and another eulogy that was given in December 1834. And in between these two eulogies, he has a short comment where he talks about covering mirrors. So we can basically date the first mention on planet Earth of any Jewish person talking about covering mirrors in a Shiva house is somewhere between 1832 and 1834. And the Chatam Sofer writes like this. He says, Nohagim lahafoch marot. He says it is customary. Now he uses the word lahafoch, which means to flip around. Mirrors, Bezayin Yamei Evel, during the 7 days of Avelut. It says, nearly, it seems to me that this is the reason. It's based on the Yerushalmi. Now let's do the background. The background of this is that the Gemara in Moed Katan, discussing the various forms of Avelut, mentions a particular kind of Avelut here on, this is Tet Vav Amud Aleph, and the Gemara there talks about this idea. It says, Avel chayav b'kfiyat hamita. An Avel is supposed to do something which is called kfiyat hamita, which we'll say is flipping over the bed. Now, this is an Avelut custom. Why is it that we do this? The Tanei Bar Kapara explains, Dmut diukani natati bahem ubavonoteyan hafachtiha kafu mitoteyan aleya. Alright, so he says like this. People are made Bidmut diukan, in other words, B'tselem Elokim. People are made in God's image. And since people are made in God's image, and a person now dies, therefore you flip over the bed. Okay, so now this is a bit cryptic as to what flipping over a bed has to do necessarily with a divine image per se, why you bed out of all things. Therefore, the Gemara and the Yerushalmi, when also Bar Kapara talks there about flipping over bed, he says like this. Bar Kapara says in the Yerushalmi, Ikonin achat tova etali betoch beitecha. In other words, there was a good person with the image of God that was in your house, and now that person died, so therefore you have to flip over your bed. Why to flip over the bed? The Gemara says, Item afkinan lishna yachapeh hasarsir. Okay, yachapeh hasarsir, that's like the modern Hebrew word sarsur, which is the intermediary. In other words, the place that functions as the intermediary to create life in the image of God, this being the bed, the marital bed, when the person dies and their divine image is now sort of corrupting in the grave, we then flip over the place where that Tselem Elokim person started from, where he originated from. That's the concept of flipping over a bed. Now, most of us are unfamiliar with this idea of flipping over a bed on account of that we don't do it anymore. Why don't we do it anymore? Well, this already Tosfot discusses the reason we don't do it anymore. Tosfot gives two reasons. He says, Masha eino hagina tala sot. Why don't we do kfiyat hamita? He says because the Gemara and the Yerushalmi says achsanai eino chayav b'kfiyat hamita. If a person is a guest somewhere in a hotel, for example, they don't have to flip over the bed. Why? Because the goyim will suspect that this person is doing some sort of magic, and then they will then do something bad to the Jewish person. I know you're making a funny look.
Would the person during Shiva be in a hotel?
Well, yeah, I don't know. They had to travel. The funeral's somewhere far away. Yes? How he says, and therefore, he says, Kmochen anu ben hanochrim. We, Tosfot says, we live among goyim. V'yesh benenu avadim u'shfachot. We have all these French chambermaids that come and they clean up our room. Tosfot lives in France, so that's what they had. And they clean up our rooms. They will see a flipped over bed, and therefore they will suspect us of doing magic. And therefore it's dangerous, we can't do it. Now, the fact is that the idea of suspicion of magic appears in other things as well. Like you have a famous thing that if a Jewish person shares a wall with a goy, and they have to do b'dikat chametz, you should not do b'dikat chametz with a candle in the crevices of that wall that you share with a goy, because the goy will be afraid seeing you at night with a candle poking around his wall that you're doing magic and is dangerous. So this is a concept that does appear. That's reason number one. Reason number two is, Od yeshetem tam, lefi shemitot shalanu kach, he says, Yecholin lishkav benachen mitzad zeh, kmo mitzad zeh. He says, look, our beds today, you flip them over, it's the same thing either way. Like our beds today, you have your mattress, right? Every time you change the clock, you flip it over, right? Every half year. So it doesn't matter, flip, not flip is the same thing. So in those days, well, this is a whole big discussion. Everyone talks about what kind of beds they have in Gemara times, but they had beds in such a way that it was uncomfortable to flip, to sleep. That look, it was weird that they were flip overable but uncomfortable. In any event, we don't do it. The Chatam Sofer then says, okay, listen. He says, if the bed in some fashion represents the image of Hashem, and therefore, we do not flip over our beds anymore. The Chatam Sofer says in the 1700s. Already the Tosfot in the 1200s said not to do it. Therefore, the mirrors, which are also a sarsur ben ish leishta, which also is something that contributes to the birth of a new baby, therefore we should flip that as well. In other words, the way that the famous thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did not want to accept the mirrors from the Jewish women for the Mizbeach, because that was like awkward on account of that when the men would come home from a hard day of slavery, the women would look in the mirror and say to the husband, look, I'm beautiful, look at me in the mirror, and that would encourage them, right, to be intimate and all of that. And that's how the Jewish people propagated themselves despite the Egyptian doing avodat parach on them and trying to wipe them out.